Josh mentioned, he just wrote that song this week.
Yeah.
And sent those lyrics over yesterday, and since then they've already changed. I think it's just the best. I love that stuff. I mean, who wants to live according to the old script that you wrote yesterday, right? I just think it's so good and refreshing. My name's Doug, if we haven't met. And on these gatherings, on these nights, last few, I've been hosting a sermon conversation, and part of my decision in the sermons are if we're going to have our interaction time, which is built in part of our gatherings, built in part of our sermons, if those are going to be in small groups or out loud to the whole group. So people have real opinions about this, by the way. I mean, there's whole group people and there's small group people. So if you're a person of prayer, this is the time to kick in on that and sort of get the influence. That's going to come at the end of our time together, but you might want to start. If you're a person of like magic, start doing that. And if you're a person of just sort of intention, I don't know, whip up your intentions to try to make a decision. And then I'll ask you. And so if you want to be somebody who's just a vocal input, then you can chime in a bit. We've been talking, as Jamie said, with kids and with adults about this idea of, and I think these are all one idea, origin stories, Genesis or beginnings, the about us, creation narratives. These are all ways of saying kind of, I think in a lot of ways, the same thing. Like, how do we get here? What are we up to? The curious thing about any kind of origin stories, beginning, Genesis, about us, is that they're always a part of another beginning. And you're living in somebody else's start. Every one of us, right, was, I think this is true of everyone in this room, was the result of the passion of your parents. I don't think there's anyone that's been generated in a lab or a test tube in here. If so, you should really bring that up, because I just think that's a whole other thing. You should brag about that at every possible point. But even at that level, just your physicality is a part of somebody else's story. What got you here today is a part of somebody else's story. We just redid the floors in this room, and I was reflecting on that. It had probably been 30 years since the floors had been redone. In fact, the people that were previously in this building before we moved in here 13 years ago redid the ceiling. And I was telling that story to somebody. They took off got rid of the plaster by putting this tongue-and-groove wood over the top. And it was so gracious. They did that about 3 years before their church closed and ended and stopped existing. And in some ways, I'm guessing people that met in this room would have said, what a waste. We spent all that money. That's a lot of money to put tongue-and-groove wood on a ceiling. I promise you. That cost this church a lot of money. They probably thought somebody, I'm guessing, sat in this room in the wooden pews that faced that direction and said, wow, we wasted a lot of money on that ceiling. None of us feel like that was wasted money on that ceiling. Like, it's really great, right? It's really been a gift to us. Our new beginnings are always a part of something else that's been going on. One of the hardest things, too, about any of us starting something new and starting something fresh and engaging in any kind of newness, in my view, is you're always having to negotiate the fact that something wasn't the way you wanted it to be. Like, there's always a little loss. There's always a little failure. There's always a little regret. There's always a little sorrow in a new beginning. And that doesn't discount it. It doesn't get rid of it. It doesn't undo it. It's part of it. It's part of the fabric of it. And then there's this expectation that sits on top of it. Because sometimes our very new beginnings tell us that there's something that's happening and going on in us. Part of the thing that I've been trying to do in the sermon is to reflect on the story and the origins of the spirituality of Christianity and what that means for us as a community, what it can mean for each of us individually. If you think of Jesus as the founder of the faith of Christianity, I want to talk a bit about that tonight. And I'll tell you that in my mind, that includes three things. Jesus as the master spiritual teacher. I think if you take Jesus at his teaching word and sort of follow Jesus as you would any other master teacher, it's really quite brilliant. Taking Jesus as a religious character, a religious figure, the child of God for whom some kind of an economy with God was acted out through the life, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. That's powerful for a lot of people too. But it's quite possible that you could have been introduced to Christianity as being about Jesus, but not really following Jesus as a spiritual teacher. So anyway, I have great interest in that for us as a community and for each of us individually. And then also Jesus' call for a way of human life. I think Jesus was spawning up a human revolution. Jesus was about how people were going to live in the world in really practical ways. Jesus was less heavenly minded than his followers, I can assure you of that. A lot of people turn to Jesus for his commentary on what life after this one is supposed to be like, of which he said nearly nothing, and find themselves disappointed because Jesus' conversations are almost always about how you're going to live now. And whatever it is that's got to do with the life hereafter is firmly rooted in the life here and now. Jesus is totally committed to the humanity's way of living. It's what we probably call in modern day parlance spiritual humanism, is what Jesus was primarily into. And then this idea that Jesus is the Son of God and thereby the brother of humanity. There's one notion in which the Son of Godness of Jesus can really take Jesus away from all the rest of us into a paradox of difference where we could never be like that, but that again is never the conversation with Jesus. Jesus is always seen as the brother of humanity as much as the Son of God, because that's the whole point for Jesus. Right? The whole point of Jesus' life and teachings of sort of live in my way and do the things I do and live the calling that I've been called to, and that the power of God that's alive in me is the same power that's alive in you. That whole stuff sort of requires that we're all part of the same origin story and that we're all kind of living in the same group. There's probably been no time in human history when the desire and need to love God, to love your neighbor, to love yourself, and to love your enemy wasn't the necessary need for all of humanity. I think it's just, you couldn't find a time when that wasn't the case. These days, yesterday, 2 days ago, that was brought back to us. We'll talk about that in a second. This is French onion soup. I don't know if you're into French onion soup or not, but I really like French onion soup. And this barely rises to the level, to me, of a good, solid, self-respected French onion soup. To me, a French onion soup is always best when it fully takes over the entire bowl and sneaks around the side. First of all, I just like the cheese and the onion and the bread in there, because that's sort of my diet preference. But I really like the idea that a bowl can't hold the French onion soup. I like it that when the soup is bigger than the bowl. I kind of like it when anything is bigger than its container, when it seeps over the edge. There is no spirituality that can fully confine and hold the teachings of Jesus. Christianity comes close, tries to, has wanted to for a couple thousand years. It has tried to make a bowl to suffice holding the content of the life and teaching of Jesus. But Jesus' life and teachings always sneak over the edge. Unfortunately, for most of us, we've been much more experienced with the bowl than we have with the contents of the bowl that seep over the edges. If you've ever enjoyed a good French onion soup, all that stuff around the edge, it's the best. This part that doesn't quite fit. It's a messy experience eating French onion soup. Order it sometime if it doesn't spill about the bowl. Just know there's another thing. I think our spirituality of Jesus following ought to be the same way. These pictures might remind you of what's happened in the last 2 years. Just take them in. There's a Sikh temple where someone claiming white supremacy walked in with weapons and shot and killed people. What? It's up there under. The Sikh temple where white supremacists walked in and executed people in a religious meeting. The people meeting at Mother Emanuel Christian Church when a white supremacist walked in and after finishing prayer with them opened fire and killed them. The Tree of Life Temple in Pittsburgh, where a white supremacist walked in with a weapon and shot and killed them. The 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, where white supremacists walked in and executed people with a firearm. It's quite possible to say that, this whole business, love God, love yourself, love your neighbor, love your enemy. I mean, really, what do we do with that? Look, people have been around this horn countless times. It can seem almost trivial. Part of the reason that Jesus' teaching as a master teacher, calling for a new way of humanity, as the Son of God and the brother of humanity, is that it is really, really hard to love your God and have that not turn you against your enemy. It is really hard to love your neighbor and have that not make you feel that your neighbor is somehow in threat and you need to turn against your enemy. It is really hard to live in self-protection of loving yourself and not feel like you have to fear your neighbor, fear your God, or fear your enemy. Coming to a place where individuals and society can live in such a way that we love our neighbor, love our God, love our enemy, and love ourselves. All of those, that is full-time pursuit for humanity. Like, that is really serious business to get at. And when it doesn't go right, it turns on humanity and it turns on God. The thing about all of those execution situations that have taken place in our society is that they all involve people who you would otherwise say should have known better. Everything our society has to offer, the people who walked into those buildings and chose to kill people of a different religion than theirs or a different belief in the religion that they hold. There's nothing in our current system of what we can do to fix that we want to get to. Like, these were not people living in small, disparate places where they didn't know. Sometimes we say the only answer to violence is education. Frankly, that whole line of thinking is just a bias against people that don't read and write very well. As if you don't read and write very well, then you're probably likely to become a terrorist. That's just kind of Americana mythology. These were all men, in this case, white men, with access to the internet, who not only could read, they could write. And they all wrote manifestos. And in their manifestos, they all said, here's the view of the world. There may or may not be competing narratives of civilization, but there are competing narratives of humanity. The pieces that we read at the beginning while the little sweeties were in the room with us before they went out, those are from the book of 1 Peter, the book of Romans, and the book of 1 Thessalonians. In all three places, early church followers of Jesus, people were getting together and having to say, be reminded that you should not return evil for evil. Jesus says it in the Sermon on the Mount. The book of Proverbs says it in Proverbs 22. And then three of the major epistles written at three different periods of time in the development of the early church, all specified specifically to people who had received this teaching, do not return evil for evil. And I will promise you, you can enter into a conversation about not returning evil for evil on this very day with nearly anyone, anywhere, who holds to the teachings of Jesus, and you will get pushback. You mean never? Well, what about, the series of whataboutisms that will start to undermine the desire to love your God, love your neighbor, love your enemy as you love yourself, all of that, the pushback is unbelievable. I am not in no way wanting to suggest that living out the four loves of Jesus is simple, is trite, or on most days feels like it's even possible. I would say, though, it is our calling, and it is achievable. The teaching that Jesus has from the Sermon on the Mount reads it like this. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. You might think to yourself, oh, maybe the Jewish faith in which Jesus was an adherent taught you should hate your enemy. Doesn't. The book of Proverbs and other places puts it really specifically. If your enemy is hungry, feed them. Like, if you're in a war and you have an enemy in your war and your enemy's going to starve, first stop the war and feed them. Then return to the war. Now, I think that's a misplaced understanding of how you should care for your enemy. Sort of to my way of thinking, and I think to Jesus's as well, the first thing you don't do when you're loving your enemy is kill them. That's sort of a baseline. You've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies. Pray, even for those who mistreat you, that you'll be like the children of your Father in heaven. The family language that Jesus uses can land very odd to a lot of us who live in a world in which we structure families differently. But the idea that we're all part of the same sense of us, with one God as Father, I think we really that very one causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, the care and the love of God goes for everyone. Why should your life be any different? I feel like we live in a day and an age in which there's almost nothing with as great of implication of helping people to stop killing their enemies as the time we live now. I'm going to be an extremist about this for a minute, which is not helpful sometimes in a conversation about vitriol. Extremism can seem like it's the problem. I want to suggest that it's not worth our energies to try to come up with the exceptions to the call of loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, loving yourself, or loving your God. I bet smart and inquisitive minds like all of ours that have access to all that we have access to could come up with a seasoned rationale at one point or the other for why that wouldn't be a good idea. I just don't think it's going to serve humanity very well to have a standard set of exceptions for what the love of God, neighbor, enemy, and self mean. I think it's impossible to separate them. I think Jesus' whole call for humanity, for us, is that we pray, that we love, and that we care. Pray for your enemies. Is not a... Look, I'm 100% in agreement with thoughts and prayers are not enough. For sure. I also don't think they're the problem. I think praying for your enemies, whether it's the enemy to you that holds you as your enemy or the one that you hold as the enemy, comes in little practices. Yesterday, I was driving from here. It was about 5:45, and I don't know if you travel this neighborhood. But with the work going on 35W that has punished a lot of people and almost no one as severely as Porch Nelson, trying to just do the work that he does and get here as often as he does. It's just unbelievable. And so they've closed a lot of entrances and exits onto 35W, which has pushed a lot of people onto Lindell Avenue, which comes right back over here. And then one of the only places to get onto Interstate 35 going south, or frankly going north, is to come down 46th Street, which is right here. So this little stoplight out here is putting up with a flow of traffic that its pacing and design was never equipped for. When you go out here, I don't know if you want to do this, just take a left and go up to the stoplight. It's where the Brugger's Bagel is and all that. And then go right through that one. And the next intersection that you hit after Nicollet is the entrance onto and off of 35W. If you're at that stoplight, it's a one-way. It's called First Avenue, and it's going one way going south. So yesterday I was sitting there, second car back, and cars are turning on to First Avenue, which is also splits and becomes the entrance onto 35W. And cars are now stopped really abruptly. No one is honking, which is surprising. I don't know why. No one's moving, and I'm just about to, reach for my horn to, add my voice, but nobody else is, so I'm a Minnesotan, so I'm going to wait for some time. And here comes a car coming the wrong way down that little road and turning left onto 46. And it's an older couple, and he clearly looks shaken. He's realized, like for a block and a half, he's going the wrong way, right? He's going north in a southbound parade. And he takes this left, and by the time I see him across his poor wife is looking at him, and I just thought, here's this guy who's driving in opposition to everybody else. And instead of all those people honking, yelling, doing things, everybody just sort of moved out of the way and let the guy take a left turn and get on about his business, and we all moved on. It was like this loving act of someone who was moving in opposition to the flow to say, we'll treat you just like you were going the right way. It'll be okay. We'll treat you like a neighbor. If you think about neighbors as those who are going along with your flow, and enemies as those who are opposing it and coming the other way, there was this great moment of recognition. These little moments where each of us have decisions. And then there are grand moments where somehow all of us join together. I don't think Jesus' call was simply to try to work in the spiritual hearts only of the people who heard him. I think he was calling for a civilization that would organize itself in such a way that even those who bring about evil would receive the love of God and the love of one another. That's your conversation question for the little groups that you're going to find yourselves in. So I'll invite you to pair up, triple up, 4 up, 5 up, find a couple of people, and for 3 minutes to talk, chat about that if you want. If you're sitting with someone that you're already used to listening to, feel free to move around for a second. I will ring that little bowl in less than 3 minutes and pull us all back together. And so have a chance to interact and share with each other.